It is the way of things that as their minds develop, children think differently, sometimes so differently that no adult would ever be able to understand. Mimsy were the borogroves by Henry Kuttner, read by Karl. There's no use trying to describe either uns through his turn or his surroundings, because for one thing, a good many million years had passed, and for another, he wasn't on Earth, technically speaking. He was doing the equivalent of standing in the equivalent of a laboratory. He was preparing to test his time machine. Having turned on the power, he suddenly realized that the box was empty, which wouldn't do at all. The device needed a control, three-dimensional solid which was directed to the conditions of another age. Otherwise, you couldn't tell, on the machine's return, where and when it had been. Whereas a solid in the box would automatically be subjected to the entropy and cosmic rate bombardment of the other era, and they could measure the changes, both qualitative and quantitative, when the machine returned. The calculators could then get to work, and presently, tell the box to briefly visited AD 1 million, or 1,000, or 1, as the case might be. Not that it mattered, except to him, but he was childish in many respects. There was little time to waste. The box was beginning to glow and shiver. He stared round wildly, fled into the next gloss hatch, and groped in the storage bin there. He came up with an armful of peculiar-looking stuff. Some of the discarded toys of his son Snowin, which the boy had brought with him when he passed over from Earth after mastering the necessary technique. Boy needed this junk no longer. He was conditioned and had put away childish things. Besides, although his wife kept the toys for sentimental reasons, the experiment was more important. He left the glass hatch and jumped the assortment into the box, slamming the cover shut before the warning signal flashed. The box went away. The manner of its departure hurt his eyes. He waited. And he waited. Eventually he gave up and built another time machine, with identical results. Snowden hadn't been annoyed by the loss of his old toys, nor had Snowden's mother, so the scientist cleaned out the bin and dealt the remainder of his son's childhood relics into the second time machine's box. According to his calculations, this one should appear on Earth in the latter part of the 19th century AD. If it actually occurred, the device remained there. Disgusted, he decided to make no more time machines. But the mischief had been done. There were two of them, and the first. Scott Paradine found it while he was playing hooky from the Glendale Grammar School. There was a geography test that day, and Scott saw no sense in memorizing place names, which, in the 1940s, was a fairly sensible theory. Besides, it was a sort of warm spring day, with a touch of coolness in the breeze, which invited the boy to lay down in the field and stare at the occasional clouds till he fell asleep. Nuts to geography. Scott dozed. But noon he got hungry, so his stocky legs carried him to a nearby store. There he invested his small hoard with a penurious care and a sublime disregard for his gastric juices. He went down by the creek to feed. Having finished his supply of cheese, chocolate, and cookies, and having drained the soda pop bottles of its dregs, Scott caught tadpoles and studied them with a certain amount of scientific curiosity. He did not persevere. Something tumbled down the bank and thudded to the muddy ground of the water, so Scott, with the word had gone around, hurried to investigate. It was a box. It was, in fact, the box. The casualty hitched to it meant little to Scott, though he wondered why it was so fused and burned. He pondered. With his jackknife he pried and probed, his tongue sticking out from a corner of his mouth. Nobody was around. Where did the box come from? Someone must have left it there, and sliding soil had dislodged it from its precarious perch. At the helix, Scott decided, quite erroneously. It was helical, but it wasn't a helix because of the dimensional warp involved. Had the thing been a model airplane, no matter how complicated, it would have held few mysteries to Scott. As it was, a problem was posed. Something told Scott the device was a lot more complicated than the spring motor he had deftly dismantled last Friday. But no boy had ever let the box unopened, unless forcibly dragged away. Scott probed deeper. The angles on this thing were funny. Short circuit, probably. That was why... the knife slipped. Scott sucked his thumb and gave vent to experienced blasphemy. Maybe it was a music box. Scott shouldn't have felt depressed. The tragedy would have given Einstein a headache and driven Steinmetz raving mad. The truth was, of course, the box had not completely entered the space-time continuum where Scott existed, and therefore it could not be opened. At any rate, not till Scott used a convenient rock to hammer the helical non-helix into a more convenient position. He hammered it, in fact, from its contact point with the fourth dimension, releasing the space-time torsion it had been maintaining. There was a brittle snap. The box jarred slightly and lay motionless, no longer only partially in existence. Scott opened it easily now. The soft woven helmet was the first thing that caught his eye, but he discarded that without much interest. It was just a cap. Next he lifted a square, transparent crystal block, small enough to cup in his palm, much too small to contain the maze of apparatus within it. In a moment, Scott had solved that problem. The crystal was a sort of magnifying glass, vastly enlarging the things inside the block. Strange things they were, too. Miniature people, for example. They moved, like clockwork automatons, and much more smoothly. It's rather like watching a play. Scott was interested in their costumes, but fascinated by their actions. The tiny people were definitely building a house. Scott wished it would catch fire so he could see the people put it out. Flames looked up from the half-completed structure. The automatons, with a great deal of odd apparatus, extinguished the blaze. It didn't take Scott long to catch on, but he was a little worried. The mannequins would obey his thoughts. By the time he discovered that, he was frightened and threw the crew from him. Halfway up the bank, he reconsidered and returned. The crystal lay partly in the water, shining in the sun. It was a toy. Scott sensed that, with the unerring instinct of a child. But he didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he returned to the box and investigated its remaining contents. He found some really remarkable gadgets. The afternoon passed all too quickly. Scott finally put the toys back in the box and lugged it home, grunting and puffing. He was quite red-faced by the time he arrived at the kitchen door. His find he hid at the back of a closet in his room upstairs. The crystal cube he slipped into his pocket, which already boasted with string, a coil of wire, 2 pennies, a wad of tinfoil, a Grammy Defense stamp, and a chunk of feldspar. Emma, Scott's 2-year-old sister, waddled unsteadily from the hall and said hello. Hello, Slug. Scott nodded, from his altitude of 7 years and some months. He patronized Emma shockingly, but she didn't know the difference. Small, plump, and wide eyes, she flopped down on the carpet and stared dolefully at her shoes. Time, Scotty, please? Sap. Scott told her kindly, but not out of the laces. Dinner, ready yet? Emma nodded. Let's see your hands. For a wonder, they were reasonably clean, although probably not aseptic. Scott regarded his own paws thoughtfully and grimacing went to the bathroom where he made a sketchy wash-up. The tadpoles had left traces. Dennis Paradine and his wife Jane were having a cocktail before dinner downstairs in the living room. He was a youngish middle-aged man with soft grey hair and a thin, prim-mouthed face. He taught philosophy at the university. Jane was small, neat, dark, and very pretty. She sipped her martini and said, New shoes. Like him? Here's the crime, Paradine muttered absently. Huh? Shoes? Not now. Wait till I finish this. I had a bad day. Exams? Yeah. Flaming youth aspiring towards manhood. I hope they die. In considerable agony. I want the olive, Jane requested. I know, Paradine said despondently. It's been years since I tasted one myself. In a martini, I mean. Even if I put 6 of them in your glass, you're still not satisfied. I want yours. Paradine regarded his wife balefully and crossed his long legs. You sound like one of my students. Like that hussy Betty Dawson, perhaps? Jane unsheathed her nails. Does she still glare at you in that offensive way? She does. The child is a neat psychological problem. Luckily she isn't mine. If she were, Paradine nodded significantly. 6 consciousness and too many movies. I suppose she still thinks she can get her passing grade by showing me her knees. which are, by the way, rather bony. Jane adjusted her skirt with an air of complacent pride. Peridine uncoiled himself and poured fresh martinis. Candidly, I just don't see the point of teaching these apes philosophy. They're all at the wrong age. Their habit patterns, their methods of thinking are already laid down. They're horribly conservative, not that they admit it. The only people who understand philosophy are mature adults or kids like Emma and Scotty. Well, don't enroll Scotty in your course, Jane requested. He isn't ready to be a doctor of philosophy. I hold no brief for a child genius, especially when it's my son. Scotty would probably be better at it than Betty Dawson, but Peridine grunted. He died an enfeebled old daughter at 5, Jane quoted dreamily. I want your olive. Here. By the way, I like the shoes. Thank you. Here's, Rosalie. Dinner? It's already, Ms. Padan, said Rosalie, hovering. I'll call Miss Emma and Mr. Scotty. I'll get him. Peridine who his head next room and roared, Kids, come and get it. Small feet scuttered down the stairs. Scott dashed into view, scrubbed and shining, a rebellious cowboy came to the zenith. Emma pursued, lifting herself carefully down the steps. Halfway, she gave it the attempt to stand upright and reversed, finishing the task monkey style, her small behind giving an impression of marvelous diligence upon the work in hand. Peridine watched, fascinated by the spectacle, until he was hurled back by the impact of his son's body. Hi, Dad, Scott shrieked. Peridine recovered himself and regarded Scott with dignity. Hi yourself. Help me to dinner. You've desecrated at least one of my hip joints. But Scott was already turning into the next room, where he stepped on Jane's new shoes in an ecstasy of affection, burbled an apology, and rushed off to find his place at the dinner table. Peridine cocked up an eyebrow as he followed, and with his pudgy hand desperately gripping his forefinger. Wonder what the young devil's been up to. No good, probably, Jane sighed. Hello, darling. What's in your ears? They're clean. Make you lick them. Well, the Airedale's tongue is far cleaner than your ears, Jane pondered, making a brief examination. Still, as long as you can hear, the dirt's only superficial. Official? Just a little, that means. Jane dragged her daughter to the table and inserted her legs into a high chair. Only waiting had Emma graduated to the dignity of dining with the rest of the family, and she was, as Peridine remarked, all eaten up with pride by the prospect. Only babies spilled food, Emma had been told. As a result, she took such painstaking care in conveying her spoon to her mouth that Peridine got the jitters whenever he watched. A conveyor belt would be the thing for Emma, he suggested, pulling on a chair for Jane. Small buckets of spinach arriving at her face at stated intervals. Dinner proceeded uneventfully until Peridine happened to glance at Scott's plate. Hello there. Sick? Been stuffing yourself at lunch? Scott thoughtfully examined the food still up before him. I've had all I need, Dad, he explained. Usually eat all you can hold, and a great deal more, Peridine said. I know growing boys need several tons of foodstuff a day, but you're below par tonight. Feel okay? Uh-huh. Honest, I've had all I need. All you want? Sure, I eat different. Something they taught you at school? Jane inquired. Scott shook his head solemnly. Nobody taught me. I found it myself. I use spit. Try again, Peridine suggested. It's the wrong word. Saliva. Uh-huh. More pepsin? Is there pepsin in these accelerated juices, Jane? I forget. There's poison in mine. Jane remarked. Russell gets left lumped in the mashed potatoes again. But Peridine was interested. You mean you're getting everything possible out of your food? No wastage and eating less? Scott thought that over. I guess so. It's not just to spit saliva. Sort of measure how much to put in my mouth at once and what stuff to mix it with. I don't know, I just do it. Said Peridine, making a note to check up later. Rather a revolutionary idea. Kids often get screwy notions, but this one might not be too far off the beam. He pursed his lips. Eventually, I suppose people will eat quite differently. I mean, the way they eat, as well as what. What they eat? I mean, Jane, our son, shows signs of becoming a genius. Oh, it's a rather good point you just made. Did you figure out yourself, Scott? Sure, the boy said, and really believed it. Where'd you get the idea? Oh, Scott wriggled. I don't know. It doesn't mean much, I guess. Paradine was unreasonably disappointed. But surely, spit! Emma shrieked, overcome by a sudden fit of badness. Spit! She attempted to demonstrate, but succeeded only in dribbling into her bib. With a resigned air, Jane rescued and reproved her daughter, where Paradine eyed Scott with rather puzzled interest. But it was not until after dinner, in the living room, that anything further happened. Any homework? No, said Scott, flushing guiltily. To cover his embarrassment, he took from his pocket a gadget he found in the box and began to unfold it. The result resembled a tesseract strung with beads. Paradine didn't see it at first, but Emma did. She wanted to play with it. No, lay off, Slug, Scott ordered. You can watch me. He fumbled with the beads, making soft, interested noises. Emma extended a fat forefinger and yelped. Scotty, Paradine said warningly. I didn't hurt her. Bit me. It did, Emma mourned. Paradine looked up. He frowned, staring. What in... Is that an abacus? He asked. Let's see it, please. Somewhat unwillingly, Scott brought the gadget across to his father's chair. Paradine blinked. The abacus, unfolded, was more than a foot square, consisted of thin, rigid wires that interlocked here and here. On the wires, the colored beads were strung. They could be slid back and forth from one spot to another, even at the points of juncture. But a pierced bead couldn't cross interlocking wires, so apparently they weren't pierced. Paradine looked closer. Each small spear had a deep groove running around it, so it could be resolved and slid along the wire at the same time. Paradine tried to pull one free. It clung as though magnetically. Iron? Looked more like plastic. The framework itself. Paradine wasn't a mathematician, but the angles formed by the wires were vaguely shocking in their ridiculous lack of Euclidean logic. They were amazed. Perhaps that's what the gadget was, a puzzle. Where'd you get this? Uncle Harry gave it to me, Scott said in the spur of the moment, last Sunday when he came over. Uncle Harry was out of town, a circumstance Scott well knew. At the age of 7, the boys soon learned the vagaries of adults follow a certain different pattern, and that they were fussy about the donors of gifts. Moreover, Uncle Harry would not return for several weeks. The expiration of that prey was unimaginable to Scott, or at least the fact that his wife would ultimately be discovered meant less to him than the advantages of being able to keep the toy. Paradine found himself growing slightly confused as he attempted to manipulate the beads. The angles were vaguely illogical. It was like a puzzle. This red bead, if it slid along the wires at that junction, should reach there, but it didn't. A maze. Odd, but no doubt instructive. Paradine had a well-founded theory that he'd have no patience with the thing himself. Scott did, however, returning to a corner and sliding beads around with much fumbling and grunting. The beads did sting when Scott chose the wrong ones and tried to slide them in the wrong direction. At last he crowed exultingly, I did it, Dad. Eh? What? Let's see. The device looked exactly the same to Paradine, but Scott pointed and beamed. I made it disappear. It's still there. That blue bead. It's gone now. Paradine didn't believe that, so he merely snorted. Scott puzzled over the framework again. He experimented. This time there were no shocks, even slight. The abacus had shown him the correct method. Now it was up to him to do one on his own. The bizarre angles of the wire seems a little less confusing now, somehow. It was a most instructive toy. It worked, Scotty thought, rather like the crystal cube. Reminded of the gadget, he took it from his pocket and right close the abacus to Emma, who was struck dumb with joy. She fell to work sliding the beads, this time without protesting against the shocks, which indeed were very minor, and being imitative, she managed to make a bead disappear almost quickly as Scott. The bead reappeared, but Scotty didn't notice. He had thoughtfully furnished an angled Chesterfield and an overstuffed chair and amused himself with the cube. There were little people inside the thing, tiny mannequins much enlarged by the magnifying properties of the crystal. They moved all right. They built a house. It caught fire with realistic seeming schemes, and the little people stood by waiting. Scott puffed urgently. Put it out. But nothing happened. What was that queer fire engine with revolving arms that had appeared before? Here it was. It came sailing to the picture and stopped. Scott urged it on. This was fun. The little people really did what Scott told them inside his head. If he made a mistake, they waited until he found the right way. They even posed new problems for him. The cube, too, was a most instructive toy. It was teaching Scott, with alarming rapidity, and teaching him very entertainingly. But it gave him no really new knowledge yet. He wasn't ready. Later. Emma grew tired of that because it went in search of Scott. She couldn't find him, even in his room, but once the other contents of the closet intrigued her. She discovered the box. It contained a treasure trove. A doll, which Scott already noticed, but discarded with a sneer. Squealing, Emma brought the doll downstairs, squatted in the middle of the floor, and began to take it apart. Darling, what's that? Mr. Bear. Obviously it wasn't Mr. Bear, who was blind, earless, but comforting in his soft fatness. But all dolls were named Mr. Bear to Emma. Jane Paradine hesitated. Did you take that for some other little girl? I didn't. She's mine. Scott came out of his hiding place, thrusting his cube in his pocket. That's from Uncle Harry. Did Uncle Harry give it to you, Emma? He gave it to me for Emma. Scott put in hastily, adding another stone to his foundation of deceit. Last Sunday. You'll break it, dear. Emma brought the doll to her mother. She comes apart, see? Oh, it... Ah! Jane sucked in her breath. Paradine looked up quickly. What's up? She brought the doll over to him, hesitated, and went into the dining room, giving Paradine a significant glance. He followed, closing the doll. Jane had already placed the doll on the cleared table. This isn't very nice, is it, Denny? It was rather unpleasant at first glance. One might have expected an anatomical dummy in a medical school, but a child's doll? The thing came apart in sections. Skin, muscles, organs. Miniature, but quite perfect as far as Paradine could see. He was interested. I know. Such things have the same connotations to a kid. Look at that liver. Is it a liver? Sure. Say This is funny. What? It isn't anatomically perfect after all. Paradine pulled up a chair. The digestive tract's too short. No large intestine. No appendix either. Should Emma have a thing like this? Wouldn't mind having it myself, Paradine said. Why on earth did Harry pick it up? No, I don't see any harm in it. I also conditioned to rack them pleasant innards. Kids don't. They figure they're solid inside. Like a potato. Emma can get a sound working knowledge of physiology from this doll. What are those? Nerves? No, those are the nerves. Arteries here, veins here. Funny sort of aorta. That's what's Latin for network anyway? Huh? Rata? Redes. Jay suggested at random. I was sort of breathing, Paradine said crushingly. Can't figure out what this luminous network of stuff is. It goes to all the body like nerves. Blood? No. Not circulatory, not neural. Funny, it seems to be hooked up with the lungs. They became engrossed, puzzling over the strange doll. It was made with remarkable production of detail, and that itself was strange, in view of the physiological variation from the norm. Where do I get that gold? Paradine said. Presently it was comparing the doll with anatomical charts. It learned little, except to increase his puzzlement. But it was more fun than a jigsaw puzzle. Meanwhile, in the adjoining room, Emma was sliding the beads to and fro in the abacus. The motions didn't seem so strange now, even when the beads had vanished. She could almost follow that new direction. Almost. Scott panted, staring into the crystal cube and mentally directing with many false starts. The building of a structure somewhat more complicated than one which had been destroyed by fire. He too was learning, being conditioned. Paradise's mistake, from a completely anthropomorphic standpoint, was that he didn't get rid of the toys instantly. He didn't realize their significance. By the time he did, the progression of circumstances had got well underway. Uncle Harry remained out of town, so Peridine couldn't check with him. 2. The midterm exams were on, which meant arduous mental effort and complete exhaustion each night, and Jane was slightly ill for a week or so. Emma and Scott had free reign with the toys. "What?" Scott asked his father one evening. "Is a wave, Dad?" "Wave?" Hesitated. "I don't think so. Isn't wave right?" "Wave is Scott for web, that it?" "I don't see how," Scott muttered and wandered off, scowling to amusing himself with the abacus. He was able to handle it quite deftly now. With the instinct of children for avoiding interruption, he and Emma usually played with the toys in private. Not obviously, of course, but the more interesting experiments were never performed under the idea of an adult. Scott was learning fast. When he noticed on the crystal cube had little relationship to the original simple problems, but they were fascinatingly technical. As Scott realized his education was being guided and supervised, although merely mechanically, he probably would have lost interest. As it was, his initiative was never squashed. Abacus, cube, doll, and other toys the children found in the box. Neither Peridine nor Jane guessed how much of an effect the concept of the time machine were having on the kids. How could they? Youngsters are instinctive dramatists for purposes of self-protection. They have not yet fitted themselves to the exigencies, to them partially inexplicable, of a mature world. Moreover, their lives are complicated by human variables. They are told by one person that playing in the mud is allowed, but that in their avocations they must not uproot flowers or small trees. Other adults vetoes mud per se. The Ten Commandments are not carved in stone. They vary. The children are helplessly dependent on the caprice of those who give them birth and feed and clothe them, and tyrannize. The young animal does not resent that benevolent tyranny, for it is an essential part of nature. He is, however, an individualist and maintains his integrity by a subtle, passive fight. Under the eyes of an adult, he changes. Like an actor on stage, when he remembers, he strives to please and also to attract attention to himself. Such attempts are not unknown to maturity, but the adults are less obvious to other adults. It's difficult to admit that children lack subtlety. Children are different from mature animals because they think in another way. We can more or less easily pierce the pretenses they set up, but they can do the same to us. Ruthlessly, a child can destroy the pretenses of an adult. Iconoclasm is a child's prerogative. Foppishness, for example. The amenities of social intercourse, exaggerated not quite to absurdity. The gigolo. Such savoir-faire, such punctilious courtesy. The dowager and the blind nothing are often impressed. Men have less pleasant comments to make. But a child gets to the root of the matter. You're silly. How can an immature human being understand the complicated system of social relationships? He can't. To him, an exaggeration of natural courtesy is silly. In his functional structure of life patterns, it is rococo. He is an egotistical animal who cannot visualize himself in the position of another, certainly not an adult. Self-contained, almost perfect natural unit, his wants supplied by others, the child is very much like a unicellular creature floating in the bloodstream, nutrient carried to him, waste products carried away. From the standpoint of logic, a child is rather horribly perfect. A baby must be even more perfect, but so alien to an adult that only superficial standards of comparison apply. The thought process of an infant are completely unimaginable. But babies think, even before birth. In the womb they move and sleep, not entirely through instinct. We are conditioned to react rather peculiarly to the idea that a nearly viable embryo may think. We are surprised, shocked into laughter and repelled. An embryo is far less human. That, perhaps, was why Emma learned far more from the toys than did Scott. He could communicate his thoughts, of course. Emma could not, except in cryptic fragments. The manner of the scrawls, for example. Give a young child pencil and paper, and he would draw something that was different to him than to an adult. The scribbles have little resemblance to a fire engine, but it is a fire engine to a baby. Perhaps it is even three-dimensional. Maybe think differently and see differently. Paradine brooded over that, reading his paper one evening and watching Emma and Scott communicate. Scott was questioning his sister. Sometimes he did it in English. More often had resorts to gibberish and sign language. Emma tried to reply, but the handicap was too great. Finally, Scott got pencil and paper. Emma liked that. Tongue-in-cheek, she laboriously wrote a message. Scott took the paper, examined it, and scowled. "That isn't right, Emma," he said. Emma nodded vigorously. She seized the pencil again and made more scrawls. Scott puzzled for a while, finally smiled rather hesitantly, and got up. He vanished into the hall. Emma returned to the abacus. Paradine rose and glanced at the paper with some mad thought that Emma might abruptly have mastered calligraphy, but she hadn't. The paper was covered with meaningless scrawls of a type familiar to any parent. Paradine pursed his lips. It might be a graph showing the mental variations of a manic-depressive cockroach, but probably wasn't. Still, it no doubt had meaning to Emma. Perhaps the scribble represented Mr. Bear. Scott returned, looking pleased. He met Emma's gaze and nodded. Paradine felt a twinge of curiosity. Secrets? Nope. Emma, asked me to do something for her. Oh. Paradine, recalling instances of babies who had babbled in unknown tongues and baffled linguists, made a note to pocket the paper when the kids had finished with it. The next day he showed the scroll to Elkins at the university. The man had a sound working knowledge of many unlikely languages, but he chuckled over Emma's venture into literature. Here's a free translation, Dennis. Quote, "I don't know what this means, but I kid the hell out of my father with it." Unquote. The two men laughed and went off to their classes. But later, Paradine was to remember the incident, especially after he met Holloway. Before that, however, months were to pass, and the situation developed even further toward its climax. Perhaps Paradine and Jane had evinced too much interest in the toys. Emma and Scott took to keeping them hidden, playing with them only in private. They never did it overtly, but with a certain unobtrusive caution. Nevertheless, Jane was somewhat troubled. She spoke to Paradine about it one evening. "That doll Harry gave Emma, yeah? I was downtown today and trying to find out where it came from. No soap. Maybe Harry bought it in New York." Jane was unconvinced. I asked him about the other things, too. They showed me their stock. Johnson's the biggest store, you know, but there's nothing like Emma's abacus. Paradine wasn't much interested. They had tickets for a show that night. It was getting late, so the subject was dropped for the nonce. Waiter crept up again when the neighbor telephoned Jane. "Scott's never been like that, Denny. Mr. Burns said he frightened the devil out of her Francis." "Francis? A little fat bully of a punk, isn't he? Like his father. I broke Burns' nose for him once when we were sophomores." "Stop boasting and listen," Jane said, mixing a highball. "Scott shows Francis something that scared him. Hadn't you better?" "I suppose so," Paradine listened. Noises in the next room told him the whereabouts of his son. "Scotty?" Bang! Scott said and appeared smiling. "I killed them all. Space pirates." "You want me dead?" "Yes, if you don't mind leaving the space pirates unburied for a few minutes. What did you do to Francis Burns?" Scott's blue eyes were reflected in incredible candor. "Huh? Try hard. You can remember, I'm sure." Oh, that. I didn't do nothing." "Anything," Jane corrected absently. "Anything. Honest. I just let him look into my television set, and it scared him." "Television set?" Scott produced a crystal cube. "Isn't really that. See?" Paradine examined the gadget, startled by the magnification. All he could see, though, was a maze of meaningless colored designs. "Uncle Harry." Paradine reached for the telephone. Scott gulped. Is Uncle Harry back in town?" "Yeah. Well, I gotta take a bath." Scott headed for the door. Paradine met Jane's gaze and nodded significantly. Harry was home, but disclaimed all knowledge of peculiar toys. Rather grimly, Paradine requested Scott to bring down from his room all of the playthings. Finally, they lay in a row on the table: cube, abacus, doll, helmet-like cap, several other mysterious uh, contraptions. Scott was cross-examined. He lied violently for a time, but broke down at last and bawled, hiccuping his confession. Get the box these things came in, Paradine ordered, and head for bed. Are you going to punish me, Daddy? For playing hooky and lying? Yes. None of the rules. No more shows for 2 weeks, no slippers for the same period. Scott gulped. You going to keep my things? I don't know yet. After a small figure had gone upstairs, Paradine dragged a chair to the table and carefully scrutinized the box. He paused thoughtfully at the focused gadgetry. Jane watched. What is it, Denny? Don't know. We'll leave a box of toys down by the creek. It might have fallen out of a car. Not at that point. The road doesn't hit the creek north of the railroad trestle. Empty watch, nothing else. Paradine lit a cigarette. Drink, honey? I'll fix it. Jane went to work, her eyes troubled. She brought Paradine a glass and stood behind him, ruffling his hair with her fingers. Is anything wrong? Of course not. Only, where do these toys come from? Johnsons didn't know, and they get their stock from New York. I've been checking up too, Paradine admitted. That doll, he poked it, rather worried me. Custom jaws, Mother, but I wish I knew who'd made them. A psychologist? That abacus. Don't they give people tests with such things? Paradine snapped his fingers. Right. Say, there's a guy going to speak in the university next week. A fellow named Holloway, who's a child psychologist. He's a big shot with quite a reputation. You might know something about it. Holloway? I don't... Rex Holloway. He's... doesn't live far from here. Do you suppose he might have these things made himself? Jane was examining the abacus. She grimaced and drew back. If he did, I don't like him. But see if you can find out, Denny. Paradine nodded. I shall. He drank his highball, frowning. He was vaguely worried, but he wasn't scared. Yet. Rex Holloway was a fat, shiny man with a bald head and thick spectacles, above which his thick brown brows lay like bushy caterpillars. Paradine brought her home to dinner one night a week later. Holloway did not appear to watch the children, but nothing he did or said was lost on him. His grey eyes, shrewd and bright, missed little. The toys fascinated him. In the living room, the three adults counted on the table where the playthings had been placed. Holloway studied them carefully as he listened to what Jane and Paradine had to say. At last, he broke his silence. I'm glad I came here tonight, but not completely. This is very disturbing, you know. Eh? Paradine stared, and Jane's face showed her consternation. Holloway's next words did not calm them. We are dealing with madness. He looked at the shocked looks they gave them. All children are mad, from an adult point of view. Ever read Hugh's High Wind in Jamaica? I've got it. Paradine secured a little box from its shelf. Holloway extended a hand, took the book, and flipped the pages until he found the place he wanted. He read aloud. Babies, of course, are not human. They are animals, and have a very ancient and rarefied culture, as cats have, fish, and even snakes. The same in kind as these, but much more complicated and vivid, since babies are, after all, one of the most developed species of the lower vertebrates. In short, babies have minds which work in terms and categories of their own, which cannot be translated into terms and categories of the human mind. Jane tried to take that calmly, but couldn't. You don't mean that, Emma... Could you think like your daughter? Like your daughter? Holloway asked. Listen, one can no more think like a baby than one can think like a bee. Paradine mixed drinks. Over her shoulder he said, You're theorizing quite a bit, aren't you? As I get it, you're implying that babies have a culture of their own, even a high standard of intelligence. Not necessarily. There's no yardstick, you see. All I say is that babies think in other ways than we do. Not necessarily better, that's a question of relative values, but with a different matter of extension. It's not for words, grimacing. Fantasy, Paradine said, rather rudely, but annoyed because of Emma. Babies don't have different senses from ours. Who said they did? Holloway demanded. They use their minds in a different way, that's all. But it's quite enough. I try and understand, Jane said slowly. All I can think of is my mixmaster. It can whip up batter and potatoes, but it can squeeze oranges too. Something like that. The brain's a colloid, a very complicated machine. We don't know much about its potentialities. We don't even know how much it can grasp. But it is known that it might become conditioned as the human animal matures. Follow certain familiar theorems, and all thought thereafter is pretty well based on patterns taken for granted. Look at this. Holloway touched the abacus. If you experiment with it, a little, Parlin said, but not much, eh? Well, why not? It's pointless, Paradine complained. Even a puzzle has to have some logic. Those crazy angles? Your mind has been conditioned to Euclid, Holloway said. So this thing bores us and seems pointless. But a child knows nothing of Euclid. Different sort of geometry from ours wouldn't impress him as being illogical. He believes what he sees. You trying to tell me this gadget's got a fourth dimensional extension? Paradine demanded. Not visually anyway, Holloway denied. All I can say is that our minds, conditioned to Euclid, can see nothing in this but an illogical tangle of wires. But a child, especially a baby, might see more. Not at first. It'd be a puzzle, of course. Only a child wouldn't be handicapped by too many preconceived ideas. Hardening of the thought arteries, Jane interjected. Paradine was not convinced. Then a baby can work calculus better than Einstein? No, I don't mean that. I can see your point more or less clearly, only... Well, look. Let's suppose there are two kinds of geometry. We'll limit it for the sake of the example. Our kind, Euclidean, another we'll call X. X hasn't got much relationship to Euclid. It's based on different theorems. 2 and 2 needn't equal 4 in it. They could equal y2, or they might not even equal. A baby's mind is not conditioned except by certain questionable factors of heredity and environment. Start the infant on Euclid. Poor kid, Jane said. Holloway shot her a quick glance. The basis of Euclid, alphabet blocks, math, geometry, algebra, they come much later. We're familiar with that development. On the other hand, start the baby with the basic principles of our X logic. Blocks? What kind? Holloway looked at the abacus. It wouldn't make much sense to us, but we've been conditioned to Euclid. Paradine poured himself a stiff shot of whiskey. That's pretty awful. You're not limiting the math. Right. I'm not limiting it at all. How can I? I'm not conditioned to X logic. There's the answer, Jane said with a sigh of relief. Who is? It takes such a person to make the kind of toys you apparently think these are. Holloway nodded, his eyes behind the sink lenses blinking. Such people may exist. Where? They might prefer to keep hidden. Superman? I wish I knew. See, Paradine, we've got yardstick trouble again. By our standards, these people might seem super-dupers in certain respects. In others, they might seem moronic. It's not a quantitative difference, it's qualitative. They think different. I'm sure we can do things they can't. Maybe they wouldn't want to, James said. Paradine tapped the diffused gadgetry in the box. What about this? It implies a purpose, sure. To transportation? One thinks of that first. If so, the box might have come from anywhere. Where things are different, Paradine asked slowly. Exactly. In space or even time. I don't know. I'm a psychologist. Unfortunately, I'm conditioned to Euclid too. Funny place it must be, Jane said. Teddy, get rid of these toys. I intend to. Holloway picked up the crystal cube. Did you question for children much? Paradine nodded. Yeah. Scott said there were people in the cube when he first looked. I asked him what was in it now. What did he say? The psychologist's eyes widened. He said they were building a place. His exact words. I asked him who, people, but he couldn't explain. No, I suppose not. Holloway muttered. It must be progressive. How long have children had these toys? About 3 months, I guess. Time enough. Perfect toy, you see, is both destructive and mechanical. It should do things to each child, and it should teach, preferably unobtrusively. Simple problems at first, later, X-logic, Jane said, white-faced. Paradigm cursed under his breath. Emma and Scott are perfectly normal. Do you know how their minds work? Now? Holloway didn't pursue the thought. He fingered the doll. We're interested to know the conditions of the place where these things came from. Induction doesn't help a great deal, though. Too many factors are whistling. We can't visualize a world based on the X factor, environment adjusted to mind's thinking in X patterns. This luminous network inside the doll, it could be anything. It could exist inside us, though we haven't discovered it yet. When we find the right stain... He shrugged. What do you make of this? It was a crimson globe, 2 inches in diameter, with a protruding knob upon its surface. What can anyone make of it? Scott? Emma? Haven't seen it until about 3 weeks ago. Then Emma started to play with it. Paradigm nibbled his lip. After that, Scott got interested. So what do they do? Hold it in front of them and move back and forth. No particular pattern of motion. No Euclidean pattern, Holloway corrected. First, they couldn't understand the toy's purpose. They had to be educated up to it. That's horrible, Jane said. Not to them. Emma is probably quicker in understanding X than is Scott, for her mind isn't yet conditioned to this environment. Paradigm sighed. But I can remember plenty of things I did as a child, even as a baby. Well, was I mad then? Things you don't remember are the criteria of your madness, Holloway retorted. But he used the word madness purely as a convenient symbol for the variation from the known human norm, the arbitrary standard of sanity. Jane put down her glass. You said that induction was difficult, Mr. Holloway, but it seems to me you're making a great deal of it from very little. After all, these toys... I am a psychologist and I specialize in children. I'm not a layman. These toys mean a great deal to me, chiefly because they mean so little. You might be wrong. Well, I rather hope I am. I'd like to examine the children. Jane rose in arms. How? After Holloway had explained, she nodded, though still a bit hesitantly. Well, that's all right, but they're not guinea pigs. The physician patted the air with a plump hand. My dear girl, I'm not a Frankenstein. To me, the individual is the prime factor. Naturally, since I work with minds. If there's anything wrong with the youngsters, I want to cure them. Paradigm put down a cigarette and slowly watched blue smoke spiral up, wavering in an unfelt draft. Can you give a prognosis? I'll try. That's all I can say. If the undeveloped minds have been turned to the X channel, it's necessary to divert them back. I'm not saying this is the wisest thing to do, but it probably is from our standards. After all, Emma and Scott will have to live in this world. Yeah, I can't believe there's much wrong. They seem about average, thoroughly normal. Superficially, they may seem so. They have no reason for acting abnormally, have they? And how can you tell if they think differently? I'll call them, Paradigm said. Make it informal, then. I don't want them to be on guard. Jane nodded towards the toys. Holloway said, leave the stuff there, eh? But the psychologist, after Emma and Scott were summoned, made no immediate move towards direct questioning. He managed to draw Scott unobtrusively into the conversation, dropping keywords now and then. Nothing so obvious as the word association test. Cooperation is necessary for that. The most interesting development occurred when Holloway took up the abacus. Mind showing me how this works? Scott hesitated. Yes, sir, like this. Skin a bead deftly through the maze and attack a course so swiftly that no one was quite sure whether it ultimately vanished. It might have been merely ledger domain. Then again, Holloway tried. Scott watched, wrinkling his nose. That's right. It's got to go there. Here? Why? Because that's the only way to make it work. But Holloway was conditioned to Euclid. There was no apparent reason why the bead should slide from this particular wire to the other. It looked like a random factor. Also, Holloway suddenly noticed this wasn't the path the bead had taken previously, when Scott had worked the puzzle. At least, as well as he could tell. Will you show me again? Scott did, twice more on request. Holloway blinked through his glasses. Random, yes, and a variable. Scott moved the bead along a different course each time. Somehow, none of the adults could tell whether or not the bead vanished. If they had expected to see it disappear, their directions might have been different. In the end, nothing was solved. Holloway, as he said goodnight, seemed ill at ease. May I come again? Wish you would, Jane told him. Any time. You still think? He nodded. Children's minds are not reacting normally. Are not dull at all, but I have the most extraordinary impression they arrive at conclusions in a way we don't understand, as though they used algebra while we used geometry. The same conclusion, but a different method of reaching it. What about the toys? Paradine asked suddenly. Get them out of the way. I'd like to borrow them, if I may. That night, Paradine slept badly. Holloway's parallel had been ill-chosen. It led to disturbing theories. The children were using the equivalent of algebraic reasoning while adults use geometry. Fair enough. Only, algebra can give you answers that geometry cannot, since there are certain terms and symbols which cannot be expressed geometrically. Suppose X logic showed conclusions inconceivable to an adult mind. Damn, Paradine whispered. Jane stirred beside him. Dear, can't you sleep either? No. He got up and went to the next room. Emma slept peacefully as a cherub, her fat arm curled around Mr. Bear. Through the open doorway, Paradine could see Scott's dark head motionless on the pillow. Jane was beside him, slipped his arm around her. Poor little people, she murmured, and how had we called them mad? I think we're the ones who were crazy, Dennis. Uh-huh. We've got jitters. Scott stirred in his sleep. Without awakening, he called was obviously a question, although it did not seem to be in any particular language. Emma gave a little mewing cry that changed pitch sharply. She had not awakened. The children lay without stirring. But, Paradine thought, with a sudden sickness in his middle, it was exactly as though Scott had asked Emma something and she had replied. Had their minds changed so that even sleep was different to them? He thrust the thought away. You'll catch cold. Let's get back to the bed. Want a drink? I think I do, Jane said, watching Emma. Her hand reached out blindly towards the child. She drew it back. Come on. We'll wake the kids. They drank a little brandy together, but said nothing. Jane cried in her sleep later. Scott was not awake, but his mind worked in slow, careful building. Thus, they'll take the toys away. The fat man. This diva dangerous, maybe, but the correct direction won't show. If Uncas Dunn hasn't them. Intransaction, bright and shiny. Emma, she's more corrupting high now and then. I still don't see how to laugh of our elixir dist. A little of Scott's thoughts could still be understood, but Emma had become conditioned to X much faster. She was thinking, too. Not like an adult or a child, not even like a human being, except perhaps a human being of a type shockingly unfamiliar to genus Homo. Sometimes Scott himself had difficulty in following her thoughts. If it had not been for Holloway, life might have settled back into an almost normal routine. The toys were no longer active reminders. Emma still enjoyed her dolls and sand mounds with a thoroughly inexplicable delight. Scott was satisfied with his baseball and his chemical set. They did everything other children did, and evinced few, if any, flashes of abnormality. But Holloway seemed to be an alarmist. He was having the toys tested, with rather idiotic results. He drew endless charts and diagrams, corresponding with mathematicians, engineers, and other psychologists, and went quietly crazy trying to find rhyme or reason in the construction of the gadgets. The box itself, with its cryptic machinery, told nothing. Fusing had melted too much of the stuff into slag. But the toys was a random element that baffled investigation. Even that was a matter of semantics. For Holloway was convinced it wasn't really random. There just weren't enough known factors. No adult could work the abacus, for example, and Holloway, the thoughtful, refrained from letting a child play with the thing. The crystal cube was similarly cryptic. showed a mad pattern of colors which sometimes moved. In this, it resembled a kaleidoscope, but the shifting of balance and gravity didn't affect it. Again, the random factor, or rather the unknown, the X pattern. Eventually, Paradigm and Jane slipped back into something uh, complacence, with the feeling they should have been cured of their mental quirk, now that the contributing cause had been removed. Certain of the actions of Emma and Scott gave them every reason to quit worrying. For the kids enjoyed swimming, hiking, movies, games, the normal function toys of this particular time sector. It was true they failed to master certain rather puzzling mechanical devices which involved some calculation. Three-dimensional jigsaw globe Paradigm had picked up, for example, but he found that difficult himself. Once in a while there were lapses. Scott was hiking with his father one Sunday afternoon, and the two had crossed the summit of a hill. Beneath them a rather lovely valley was spread. Pretty, isn't it? Paradigm remarked. Scott examined the scene gravely. So wrong, he said. Eh? I don't know. What's wrong about it? Gee. Scott laughed in a puzzled silence. I don't know. The children missed their toys, but not for long. Emma recovered first, though Scott still moped. He held unintelligible conversations with his sister and studied meaningless scrawls she drew on paper he supplied. It was almost as though he was consulting her. And then different problems beyond his grasp. If Emma understood more, Scott had more real intelligence and manipulatory skill as well. He put the gadget with his mechanical set, but was dissatisfied. The apparent cause of this dissatisfaction was exactly what Paradigm was relieved when he viewed the structure. It was the sort of thing a normal boy would make, vaguely reminiscent of a cubistic ship. It was a bit too normal to please Scott. He asked Emma more questions, now in private. She thought for a while and then made more scrawls with an awkward, clutched pencil. Can you read all that stuff? Jane asked her son one morning. Not read it exactly. I can tell what she means. Not all the time, but mostly. Is it writing? No. It doesn't mean what it looks like. It's symbolism, Paradise suggested over his coffee. Jane looked at him, her eyes widening. Danny? He winked and shook his head. Later, when we were alone, he said, Don't let Holloway accept you. I'm not implying the kids are corresponding in an unknown tongue. If Emma draws a squiggle and says it's a flower, that's an arbitrary rule. Scott remembers that. Next time she draws the same sort of squiggle or tries to... Well... Sure, Jane said doubtfully. If you notice, Scott's been doing a lot of reading lately. I noticed. Nothing unusual, no. No Kant or Spinoza. He browses, that's all. Well, so did I at his age, Paradigm said, and went off to his morning classes. He lunched with Holloway, which had become a daily habit, and spoke of Emma's literary endeavors. Was I right about symbolism, Rex? The psychologist nodded. Quite right. Own language is nothing but arbitrary symbolism now. At least in this application. Look here. On his napkin he drew a very narrow ellipse. What's that? You mean, what does it represent? Yeah, what does it suggest to you? Could be a crude representation of what? Plenty of things, Paradigm said. River glass, a fried egg, a loaf of French bread, a cigar. Holloway added a little triangle to the drawing, apex joint at one end of the ellipse. He looked up at Paradigm. A fish, the latter said instantly. A familiar fit symbol for a fish. Even without fins or eyes or mouth, it's recognizable, because we've been conditioned to identify this particular shape with our mental picture of a fish. The basis of a rebus. A symbol to us means a lot more than what we actually see on paper. What's in your mind when you look at this sketch? Why, a fish. Keep going. What do you visualize? Everything. Scales, Paradigm said slowly, looking into space. Water, foam, fish eyes, the fin, the colors. So the symbol represents a lot more than just that abstract idea of a fish. Note the connotation is that of a noun, not a verb. It's hard to express actions by symbolism, Anyway, reverse the process. Suppose you want to make a symbol for some concrete noun, say bird. Draw it. Paradigm drew two connected arcs, concavity down. The lowest common denominator, Holloway nodded. A natural tendency is to simplify, especially when a child is seeing something for the first time and has few standards of comparison. He tries to identify the new thing with what's already familiar to him. Ever notice how a child draws the ocean? He didn't wait for an answer. He went on. A series of jagged points, like the oscillating line on a seismograph. When I first saw the Pacific, I was about 3. I remember it pretty clearly. It looked tilted. A flat plane slid under an angle. The waves were regular triangles. It baked upward. Now, I don't see them stylized that way, but later remembering I had to find some familiar standard of comparison, which is the only way of getting any conception of an entirely new thing. The average child tries to draw these rectangular triangles, but his coordination is poor. He gets a seismograph pattern. All of which means what? A child sees the ocean. He stylizes it. He draws a certain definite pattern, symbolic to him of the sea. Emma scrawls me symbols too. It doesn't mean the world looks different to her, brighter perhaps and sharper, more vivid, and with a slacking of perfection above her eye level. What I do mean is that our thought processes are different, as they translate what she sees into abnormal symbols. You still believe? Yes, I do. Her mind has been conditioned unusually. It means she breaks down what she sees into simple, obvious patterns. Realize the significance of those patterns that we can understand, like the abacus. She saw a pattern in that, though to us it was completely random. Paradigm abruptly decided to taper off these luncheon engagements with Holloway. The man was an alarmist. His theories were growing more fantastic than ever, and he dragged in anything, applicable or not, that would support them. Rather sardonically, he said, "Do you mean Emma's communicating with Scott in an unknown language? In symbols for which he hasn't any words? I'm sure Scott understands a great deal of these scrawls. To him, an isosceles triangle may represent any factor, though probably a concrete noun. Would the man who knew nothing of chemistry understand what H2O meant? Would he realize the symbol could evoke a picture of the ocean?" Paradigm didn't answer. Instead, he mentioned to Holloway Scott's curious remark that the landscape from the hill had looked all wrong. A moment later, he was inclined to regret his impulse, for the psychologist was off again. Scott's thought patterns of building up to a summit doesn't equal this world. Perhaps he's subconsciously expecting to see the world where these toys came from. Paradigm stopped listening. Enough was enough. The kids were getting along all right, and the only remaining disturbing factor was Holloway himself. That night, however, Scott evinced an interest, what is significant, in eels. There's nothing apparently harmful in natural history, Paradigm explained about eels. But where do they lay their eggs? Or do they? That's still a mystery. The spawning grounds are unknown. Perhaps the Sargasso Sea. Funny, said Scott, thinking deeply. Somebody do the same thing, more or less. They go upriver to spawn. Paradigm went into detail. Scott was fascinated. But that's right, Dad. They're born in the river and they learn how to swim, they go down to the sea. Then they come back to lay their eggs, huh? Right. Oh, they wouldn't just come back, Scott pondered. They'd just send their eggs. It'd take a very long ovipositor. His scent wasn't entirely satisfied. Fires he contended sent their seeds long distance. They don't guide them. Not many find fertile soil. Flowers haven't got brains, though. Dad, why do people live here? Glendale? No, here. This whole place. It isn't all there is, I bet. Do you mean the other planets? Scott was hesitant. This is only part of the big place. It's like the river where the salmon go. Why don't people get down to the ocean when they grow up? Paradigm realized that Scott was speaking figuratively. He felt a brief chill. The ocean? The young of the species are not conditioned to live in the more complete world of their parents. Having developed sufficiently, they enter that world. Later they breed. The fertilized eggs are buried in the sand far up the river where later they hatch. And they learn. Instinct alone is fatally slow, especially in the case of a specialized genius unable to cope even with this world, unable to feed or drink or survive, unless someone has foresightedly provided for those needs. The young, fed and tended, would survive. There would be incubators and robots. They would survive, but they would not know how to swim downstream to the vaster world of the ocean. So they must be taught, must be trained and conditioned in many ways, painlessly, subtly, unobtrusively. Children love toys that do things, and if those toys teach at the same time. In the latter half of the 19th century, an Englishman sat on a grassy bank near a spring. A very small girl lay near him, staring up in the sky. She discarded a curious toy which she had been playing, and now was murmuring a wordless little song to which the man listened with half an ear. "What was that, my dear?" he asked at last. "Just something I made up, Uncle Charles." "Sing it again." He pulled out a notebook. The girl obeyed. "Does it mean anything?" She nodded. "Oh, like those stories I tell you, you know? The wonderful stories, dear. You put them in a book someday?" "Yes, but I must change them quite a lot, or no one will understand. But I don't think I'll change your little song." "You mustn't. If you did, it wouldn't mean anything." "I won't change that stanza anyway," he promised. "Just what does it mean?" "It's the way out, I think," the girl said doubtfully. "I'm not sure yet. My magic toys told me. Wish I knew what London shop sold those marvelous toys. Mama bought them for me. She's dead. Papa doesn't care." She lied. She found the toys in a box one day. She played by the Thames, and they were indeed wonderful. A little song. Oh, Charles thought it didn't mean anything. He wasn't her real uncle, but he was nice. The song meant a great deal. It was the way. Presently she would do what it said, and then... But she was already too old. She never found the way. Peregrine had dropped Holloway. Jane had taken a dislike to him, naturally enough, since what she wanted most of all was to have her fears calmed. Since Scott and Emma acted normally now, Jane felt satisfied. It was partially wishful thinking, to which Peregrine could not entirely subscribe. Scott kept bringing gadgets to Emma for her approval. Occasionally she'd shake her head. Sometimes she would look doubtful. Very occasionally she would signify agreement. Then there would be an hour of laborious, crazy scribbling on scraps of notepaper, and Scott, after studying notations, would arrange and rearrange his rocks, bits of machinery, candle ends, and assorted junk. Every day the maid cleaned them away, and each day Scott began again. He condescended to explain a little to his puzzled father, who could see no rhyme or reason in the game. "But why does Pebble right here?" "It's hard and round, Dad. It belongs there." "So is this one hard and round?" "Well, that's got Vaseline on it. When you get that far, you can't see a hard, round thing. What comes next? This candle?" Scott looked disgusted. "That's towards the end. The iron ring's next." It was, Peregrine thought, like a scout trail through the woods, markers in the labyrinth. But here again was the random factor. Logic halted. Familiar logic, as Scott's motive in arranging the junk as he did. Peregrine went out. Over his shoulder he saw Scott pull a couple pieces of paper and a pencil from his pocket and head for Emma, who was squatted in the corner thinking things over. Well. Jane was lunching with Uncle Harry. On this hot Sunday afternoon there was little to do but read the papers. Peregrine set himself in the coolest place he could find with the Collins and lost himself in the comic strips. An hour later, a clatter of feet up from the stairs roused him from his doze. Scott's voice was crying exultingly, "This is it, Slug. Come on." Peregrine stood up quickly, frowning. As he went into the hall, the telephone began to ring. Jane had promised to call. His hand was on the receiver when Emma's faint voice squealed with excitement. Peregrine grimaced. What the devil was going on upstairs? Scott shrieked, "Look out! This way!" Peregrine, his mouth working, his nerves ridiculously tense, forgot the phone and raced up the stairs. The door of Scott's room was opening. The children were vanishing. They went in fragments, like thick smoke in the wind, or like movement in a distorting mirror. Hand in hand they went in a direction Peregrine could not understand, and as he blinked there on the threshold, they were gone. "Emma," he said, dry-throated. "Scotty." On the carpet lay a pattern of markers, pebbles, an iron ring, junk, a random pattern. A crumpled sheet of paper blew towards a paradigm. He picked it up automatically. Kids, where are you? Don't hide. Emma! Scotty! Downstairs the telephone stopped its shrill, monotonous ringing. Paradigm looked at the paper he held. It was a leaf torn from a book. There were delineations and marginal notes in Emma's meaningless scrawl. Standard verse had been so underlined or scribbled over that it was almost illegible. But Paradigm was still familiar with Through the Looking Glass. His memory gave him the words. 'Twas Brig and the slivy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy with the borogroves and the moan rafts outgrabe. Idiotically, he thought. Humpty Dumpty explained it. A wabe is the plot of grass around a sundial. A sundial. Time. It's something to do with time. A long time ago, Scotty asked me what a wabe was. Symbolism. 'Twas brillig. A perfect mathematical formula, given all conditions, symbolism the children had finally understood. The junks on the floor. The toes had to be made slithy. Vaseline? And they had to be placed in a certain relationship so that they'd gyre and gimble. Lunacy. But it had not been lunacy to Emma and Scott. They thought differently. They used exologic. These notes Emma had made on the page. She translated Carol's words into symbols both she and Scott could understand. The random factor had made sense to the children. They fulfilled the conditions of the time-span equation. And the moon rasped out grabe. Paradigm made a rather ghastly little sound deep in his throat. He looked at the crazy pattern on the carpet. If he could follow it, as the kids had done, but he couldn't. The pattern was senseless. The random factor defeated them. He was conditioned to Euclid. Even if he went insane, he still couldn't do it. It would be the wrong kind of lunacy. His mind had stopped working now, but in a moment, the stasis of incredulous horror would pass. Paradigm crumbled the page in his fingers. Emma, Scotty, he called in a dead voice as though he could expect no response. Sunlight slanted through the open window, brightening the golden pelt of Mr. Bear. Downstairs, the ringing of the telephone began again. The end.